The One Piece is a drum.
What the fuck?
Roger reached Laugh Tale. He found the One Piece. He learned the true history, and somehow he still said he was too early. And when you start looking at the pieces Oda attached to that moment, a pattern starts to show up. Sound keeps appearing around some of the biggest turning points in the story. The Golden Bell, Binks Sake, the Drums of Liberation. So what if he arrived at the right place without the one thing needed to use what he found? Then the One Piece may not be something Luffy finds. It may be something he has to play, and the place where it's been waiting may even be more out of pocket than the treasure itself. Before getting into Laugh Tale and Roger, there is a simple question to answer. Why would the One Piece be a drum at all? On paper, it sounds ridiculous. A drum feels almost too simplistic, but simplicity has never stopped Oda before. One Piece is full of ideas that sound absurd until you notice how often they keep showing up, and sound is one of them. Oda constantly uses sound to mark important shifts in the story. When Luffy awakens his Devil Fruit, the moment is introduced through a heartbeat, the Drums of Liberation. And that choice matters because Oda could have emphasized almost anything. He could have focused on Luffy's appearance or his powers. Instead, he focuses on the rhythm. The same pattern shows up throughout the series. The dawn sound effect appears whenever Oda wants a moment to land with weight or impact. And according to Oda himself, the sound effect was inspired by the dramatic drum strikes used in classic Japanese period stories. It does show that Oda repeatedly connects major turning points to rhythm, impact, and sound. So before asking whether the One Piece could be a drum, it's worth asking why Oda keeps bringing us back to one. Skypiea gives us one of the clearest examples of how Oda uses sound. For 400 years, Mont Blanc Noland was remembered as a liar. The city of gold was gone and nobody could find it, and every piece of evidence seemed to be pointed against him. Then Luffy rang the Golden Bell, Cricket hears it from far below, and suddenly the argument is over. Noland was telling the truth. The bell doesn't simply reveal anything new. The city was already there. The history was already real. The bell simply carries proof across the distance. That is what gives the moment its weight. The bell's value isn't in the gold. It's that a single ring restores history, fulfills a promise, and keeps Shandora's fire burning. In Skypiea, that sound proves a people, a history, and a promise survived across time. Skypiea's ending is about a sound reconnecting people to what was lost. But a drum can do something a little different from a bell. It gives people something that they can move to together. That's why drums show up so often in festivals, ceremonies, marches, celebrations, and even warfare. Their job isn't just to be heard, their job is to get people in sync. And that's an interesting distinction when you look at One Piece. The Golden Bell proves that the past was real. The Drums of Liberation show up when people start breaking free in the present. That's why a drum starts to make more sense as the final treasure. If Joy Boy wanted to leave behind a way to reconnect a divided world, a drum would do something a bell can't. It wouldn't just send a message, it would give everyone the same rhythm to follow. And even Enel inadvertently proves this point by being the ultimate hypocrite. The man literally wears a drum kit on his back like a budget rock star, and yet he spends the entire arc winning the I don't give a fuck wars, floating on his couch, eating apples, and aggressively disrespecting local history out of pure spite and greed. He's trying to gatekeep the Shandy and Spotify playlist only for Luffy to use the Golden Bell to force feed him the truth. But let's talk about Sake for a second, because the connection between Sake and drums goes back further. In one of Japan's oldest myths, the goddess Ame no Uzume dances on an overturned sake barrel to draw the sun goddess Amaterasu out of hiding and bring light back to the world. What's interesting is that Ame no Uzume isn't just associated with dancing. She's connected to joy, laughter, celebration, and the arrival of a new dawn. In many tellings, her performance on that sake barrel is also treated as the origin of taiko drumming. So the sake vessel and the drum end up being tied to the same moment. Joy bringing light back after a period of darkness. That's a surprising familiar combination for a story centered around a sun god whose entire role is bringing a new dawn to the world. Oda keeps bringing up drums, sake, joy, celebration, and the dawn of a new era into the conversation, which raises a simple question. If Roger found the treasure, what exactly was he waiting for? Roger's trip to Laugh Tale creates a problem that we still talk about to this day, like imagining finding the Holy Grail and realizing it's just a giant sign that reads, "Please check back in 20 years. Thanks for playing." If finding the One Piece was all that mattered, there wouldn't be a problem to solve. But the story keeps showing us situations where discovering the truth isn't enough on its own. Odin learns the truth, but can't open Wano. The scholars of Ohara were right on the verge of dropping the ultimate truth bomb right before the world government dropped the literal one. One generation finds something, but the next generation could be the one that acts on it. With that in mind, Laugh-Tale stops feeling like the finish line and starts looking like the ultimate baton pass. Roger secured the prize. He just realized he was running the first leg of a much longer race. The story actually gives us a clue about what Roger was waiting for. After the Roger pirates leave Fishman Island, the Sea King starts talking about the future, and they mention a sovereign who'll be born in 10 years and then spend another 15 years growing. And we know who that is, but the conversation doesn't stop there. The Sea Kings also mention another sovereign who'll be born in a distant sea. Then they talk about the day the two sovereigns meet again. The focus isn't on Laugh-Tale, the treasure, or even the past. It's for a future meeting. So looking at it that way, Roger's problem starts to make more sense. He wasn't missing information. He arrived before the people connected to that information were in place. The truth was already there. The people needed to act on it weren't. And that idea shows up a lot in important stories throughout One Piece. Oda rarely has one person inherit everything. He usually splits important responsibilities across multiple people. Odin is a good example. Momonosuke inherits Odin's role as the future shogun and the responsibility of protecting Wano. Yamato inherits Odin's connection to the outside world, his journal, and his desire to see what lies beyond the country's borders. Neither one replaces Odin on their own. They're carrying different parts of the same legacy. Roger spent his entire journey learning about people and events that hadn't happened yet. Luffy keeps meeting those people directly. Roger learned about Poseidon. Luffy meets Shirahoshi. Roger learned about Joy Boy. Luffy is the person Zunisha recognizes, Joy Boy. Roger reached Laugh-Tale and realized the future he had learned about still hadn't arrived yet. Luffy is traveling through the world as those pieces are finally starting to come together. Roger being too early stopped sounding like a failure on his part, and he found what he was supposed to find. He just reached it before the world was ready. And that raises a different question. If the right people are finally in place, then what exactly are they supposed to do? Because finding the treasure is one thing. Understanding what the treasure is supposed to accomplish is another. The world is littered with the corpses of people who found the truth, from the scholars of Ohara to the Pirate King himself. History has been unmasked again and again, and yet the cage hasn't budged. That's worth paying attention to because it tells us something about the world government. Their power doesn't depend on nobody learning the truth. Their power depends on preventing that truth from changing anything. That's why the One Piece can't simply be another source of information. The story already has books, poneglyphs, records, and people who know what happened. Adding one more way to learn the truth wouldn't really solve the problem. The bigger issue is what happens after people learn it. If Joy Boy left something behind to help change the world, then its purpose has to go beyond storing information. One Piece has already explored several ways information could spread across the world. Roger's execution speech reached people far beyond Logtown. Whitebeard's final declaration reached people far beyond Marineford. Vegapunk pushed that idea even further. His broadcast reached nearly the entire world, and Punk Records showed what shared knowledge on a global scale can look like. But all those examples run into the same problem. A message can be interrupted. The person delivering it can't be killed. People can disagree about what they hear. Others can ignore it completely. Information doesn't become effective just because more people can hear it. Making information available and making people act on it aren't always the same thing. But if there is one thing you can act on right now, it's liking the video, subscribing to the channel, clicking the bell, and the hype button if talking about getting drunk and banging on drums in the same breath makes way too much sense to be the literal key to the 900-year-old global conspiracy. That's why Vegapunk's broadcast is so important. It shows the story thinking beyond hidden history and asking a different question. What would it take for information to actually change the world? This is where the drum theory starts leaning on something the story has already established. During the time skip, Nami learns about Witheria technology that can tie wind into knots and release it later. At the time, it's presented as a weather tool. It's useful, but it's easy to overlook. Then much later, Oda brings back the same idea through Joy Boy. Emmett releases haki that had been stored inside a knot for centuries, and that's important because it shows the Witheria example wasn't a one-off invention. The story is working with a broader rule. Something invisible can be stored inside a physical object and released later. Witheria does it with wind. Joy Boy does it with haki. Once those two moments are connected, the knot on Emmett feels less like a random plot point and more like the payoff to an idea Oda introduced much later. That's where the drum starts becoming interesting. If haki can carry a person's will, and if that will can be stored and released later, then Joy Boy may have left behind more than information. he may have left behind something designed to be activated. There are also some useful visual parallels between drums and sake barrels. Traditional taiko drums use rope and tension to hold their shape. Sake barrels are wrapped in rope and opened by striking them during Kagami Baraki. In both cases, something is held in place until the moment it's used. It fits with a story that already uses knots as a way to store and release invisible forces, and if the One Piece is some kind of drum, then Luffy's heartbeat starts to matter for a practical reason. The Drums of Liberation may not simply signal Joy Boy's return. They may be the rhythm needed to activate whatever Joy Boy left behind. One Piece keeps returning to the idea of a public stage. Roger's execution is the clearest example. The world government built the platform to end his influence. Instead, he used it to start the Great Pirate Era. Whitebeard does something similar at Marineford. His final words reach far beyond the battlefield and push the search for the One Piece into a new phase. And there's also an interesting parallel in the way Whitebeard's Devil Fruit works. The Gorigori no Mi creates vibrations and shockwaves that travel across great distances. That's obviously not the same thing as a drum, but it places one of the most closest people to the One Piece around another power built on transmitting force outward from a single source. Then Wano gives us another version through Yasue. Orochi turns the execution into a public spectacle, and Yasue uses it to protect the rebellion and keep the alliance alive. A public stage becomes an amplifier. That's one reason the drum idea keeps coming back to me. Drums aren't private instruments, they're meant to be heard by groups of people at the same time. Even some of the visual parallels start to line up. Roger's execution platform resembles the elevated frame used to support large taiko drums. Yasue carries another connection through his role as a taiko mochi, a role he took on after going into hiding when Orochi fully seized control of Wano, giving himself a new identity as a traditional entertainer whose title literally means drum bearer. One Piece keeps linking major turning points into public performances, sound, and messages that spread beyond the people who hear them first. If Joy Boy wanted to leave behind something capable of reaching the entire world, a drum would fit that pattern surprisingly well. So with the concept firmly in place, our next problem is a literal game of hide and seek. We already know the One Piece is on Laugh Tale. The mystery is what Laugh Tale actually is. And One Piece has never treated islands as ordinary pieces of geography. Zou is a civilization carried on the back of a living elephant. Thriller Bark is an island-sized ship built to resemble a giant sea creature. So the idea that the final island could be connected to something alive isn't unusual for the story. That's where the whale clues start standing out. The Sea Kings don't talk about the day the treasure was found. They talk about the day the two sovereigns meet again, and they specifically mention the whales waiting for that moment. Then there's Laboon at the entrance to the Grand Line. He's connected to Binks Sake, music, and a promise that's been waiting decades to be fulfilled. He's also important for a more practical reason. Crocus literally lives inside him. Oda has already shown us a whale functioning as a living vessel with space inside it. Then there's the whale tree on Zou sitting above one of the road poneglyphs that helps guide the crew toward Laugh Tale. The story keeps placing whales near the same ideas: navigation, promises, music, inherited will, and the route to the final island. And if those connections are intentional, then the whale clues may be pointing towards more than a destination. They may be pointing toward whatever is carrying the final treasure. So if Laugh Tale is connected to a whale, what's the bigger picture here? One Piece has already shown a smaller version of this idea before. In Skypiea, Luffy ends up inside Nola. Now, Nola isn't a whale, she's a giant serpent, but she fills a similar role. She's a massive living creature connected to an old promise, hidden treasure, and forgotten history. There's literal treasure sitting inside Nola, and the road poneglyphs point in a similar direction. They don't give the crew a normal destination, they create a location through 4 coordinates. That suggests that the final destination might not be a fixed island at all. It may be the place where Laugh Tale becomes accessible, and in that case, the road poneglyphs aren't guiding the crew to land, they're guiding the crew to an encounter. Whitebeard fits into this picture in an interesting way. He's the man Roger was willing to trust with knowledge about finding the One Piece, and his flagship is the Moby Dick, one of the most famous white whales in fiction. Even his design stays connected to whale imagery through his legendary mustache, so I think it's worth noting that Oda is tying all of this whale imagery to an actual character who was infamously thought as the closest to being Roger's successor. And if this final vessel is a whale, the most obvious One Piece species would be an island whale. Laboon already proves they exist, and Crocus living inside him proves that kind of whale can't hold a livable space inside its body. And the Whitebeard connection adds the white whale idea through the Moby Dick. So under this theory, the final vessel could be a white or albino island whale. basically Laboon's species but tied to the final island instead of the entrance to the Grand Line. There's also a strange parallel in Roger's own bloodline. Rouge carries Ace inside her body far longer than she should have been able to, protecting Roger's child until the time is right. If the final treasure is inside a whale, that image starts to matter. Roger's child was carried inside a living body. Joy Boy's treasure may have been carried inside a living body too. And in both cases, what's being protected is tied to the future Roger believed would come after him. Ace later became a fireman through the Marimar no Mi, which gives the parallel another layer. The possible heir to Roger's dream is carried inside Rouge like a hidden flame. The One Piece may be carried inside an island whale like a hidden sun waiting to be released. Is that proof? No, but as a story pattern, it fits the same idea. Something connected to the future is preserved inside a living vessel until the right era arrives. It also makes Ace's role feel more tragic because Roger believed his son might be the one to reach the future he couldn't, and Ace eventually becomes a fireman carrying a power that visually connects into the sun, freedom, and inherited will. And his final major battle before Marineford is literally fire against darkness, Ace against Blackbeard. So if Ace was one possible son Roger imagined for the next era, then Luffy becomes the version that actually reaches the role. Not just fire as a power, but Nika's rhythm as the thing that can activate the treasure and return the world's stolen history. And that makes Binks' sake a lot more important, because the normal assumption is that Binks is the person connected to the sake, maybe the one who brewed it, maybe the one it belongs to. But the song keeps repeating one specific action. The sake is being delivered across the sea. Delivery means movement. It means a journey. It means something has to carry it. And the song keeps pairing that delivery with ships, waves, drums, dawn, laughter, and a wandering tale. So, if Laugh Tale is connected to a whale, and the One Piece is tied to a final sake-like celebration, then Binks may not only be the name of the sake source, Binks may be the name of the whale carrying the song, the sake, and the treasure across the sea. Assuming that checks out, then the final image is pretty simple. Binks is the carrier. Laugh Tale is placed inside of Binks, and the One Piece is the drum Roger found there. That's where the Drums of Liberation come back into the picture. The story treats Luffy's heartbeat as a specific signal. Zunisha recognizes it immediately. Ancient technology responds to Joy Boy's presence. Gear 5 doesn't simply make Luffy stronger, it creates the rhythm tied to Joy Boy's return, which means that there could be a practical method to the madness that is Luffy outscaling Bugs Bunny in Toon Force. I've talked before about why Luffy's fruit might not be just rubber and how Gear 5 could connect to the way his body and soul affect the world around him. And if you want a full breakdown, check out the card above. For this theory, the main point is simple. Gear 5 doesn't change how Luffy fights. It may change what his body can activate. If the One Piece is a drum carrying Joy Boy's stored will, then Luffy's role becomes practical. Roger can find the drum, Luffy can activate it. The heartbeat creates the rhythm activates the drum, and the drum releases whatever Joy Boy left behind. It could be hockey, it could be memories, it could be history, it could be all those things together. The important part is that the treasure stops functioning like an object and starts functioning like an event. Under that reading, Roger wasn't missing information. He was missing the one thing the treasure required to work. If that's how the One Piece works, then the final question isn't how the drum is activated, it's what happens when it is. One Piece has already used this kind of structure before. In Alabasta, the rain returned and Crocodile's deception fell apart. In Dressrosa, people's memories returned and Doflamingo's deception fell apart. In both cases, the turning point wasn't learning something new, it was the return of something that had been taken away. That's why the idea of a worldwide release is important here. The world government's greatest advantage isn't keeping every secret hidden, it's separating people from the history that belongs to them. If Joy Boy's will, memory, or history is stored inside the One Piece, then activating the drum wouldn't simply reveal information, it would return something that had been missing for 800 years. And that may also explain Whitebeard's final warning. He said a massive war would break out when the One Piece is found. If the One Piece releases the true history to the entire world at once, then that reaction becomes much easier to understand. And that changes everything because the Void Century isn't just missing history, it's missing accountability. If the world learns what happened during those years, how the world government was formed and what was taken from the people who lost, it gives people a target. Suddenly, the enemy isn't just some distant system nobody can explain. It's the government sitting on top of the world because of whatever happened 800 years ago. That kind of truth wouldn't just shock people, it would give kingdoms, rebels, pirates, and ordinary citizens a reason to rise up against the government collectively. The discovery of the One Piece wouldn't be the thing that changes the world. The truth that comes with it would. And if that truth can only be released through the Drums of Liberation, then the Gama Gama no Mi starts looking different too. It's part of the mechanism. Under that reading, the One Piece stops looking like a treasure that's meant to be collected. It starts looking like something that was meant to be used. But if the One Piece really can restore something the world had been missing for 800 years, what happens to someone who spent 800 years benefiting from missing history when that history comes back? That's what I talk about in this video here.